This is part 3 of chapter 3. So we were talking about water as the solvent of life, that it's a universal solvent, and that's because of the polarity of a water molecule. What happens is the water molecules will surround other molecules, and based on the positive and negative attraction. And so because of that, they separate out the molecules of the solute, and which causes it to essentially dissolve. So a solvent dissolves a solute, and when it does that, it's creating a solution. So again, looking just as a reminder of the definitions of those three things, and then an aqueous solution is one in which water is the solvent. So make sure you understand those definitions. So what will dissolve in water? Basically something that has a positive or a negative charge. So that means something that's polar. So we call things that are attracted to water hydrophilic. Hydro being water, philic meaning attraction to. It's actually phileo is love. So loving water. So something that's hydrophilic loves water, which also means that it's going to dissolve in water. So these substances are again polar, which is what allows the water molecules to surround them. So you can see in this lower picture here on the right, the yellow molecules are the solute, water is the solvent, and the polarity of the positive end of water is attracted to the negative charge of this solute. So this solute is hydrophilic, and it's polar. It has a negative charge. On the other hand, we also have the other portion of this actually molecule being separated out. So we have the positive end of this molecule being pulled away from the negative, and in this case we have the negative portion of water molecules being attracted to the positive charge. So these polar molecules, this was a polar molecule. It had a positive and a negative end to it that actually gets separated out by the polar charge of a water molecule. So that's what makes water a good solvent. This next picture shows the same thing. In this case, it's defining what's being dissolved. So the solute here is sodium chloride, which is also salt. And you can see sodium chloride is a polar molecule. It has the negative chlorine and the positive sodium. And so the chloride, it gets separated from the sodium, and while it's doing that, we actually have it going from this solid here to an aqueous solution where it's actually dissolved in water. So the solute would dissolve into the water and make a solution that is aqueous, meaning it has dissolved into the different ionic particles. And we often think of these hydrophilic substances like sodium chloride as being the only things that can be dissolved. But even larger molecules like proteins can be polar. So even proteins can dissolve in water if they actually have an ionic and polar region to them. So depending on what the R group of the protein is, which is the defining portion of a protein of each of the amino acids, if there is a polarity to it, then that protein will also go through the same dissolving process. Now, what will not dissolve in water is something that is hydrophobic. So hydrophobic substances are ones that are afraid of water. Phobic, afraid of water. So these substances are actually just simply nonpolar. They do not have a charge. So these substances don't have any attraction to water, so they cannot be dissolved or separated apart by a water molecule. That force, the polarity of that water molecule can have no effect on them. So for example, oil molecules are hydrophobic because they have relatively non-polar bonds. They have very strong covalent bonds. So you can see here basically the CHs, the carbon hydrogen bonds that occur in an oil or a fat, are making it very stable and hydrophobic. Soap is something that is dipolar. So it's kind of interesting. Soap is both hydrophobic and hydrophilic. So it actually has a hydrophilic end, which is attracted to the water. And it has a hydrophobic tail, which is not. And so because of that, it actually is able to cut through and break apart the hydrogen bonds in water. And so it's able to, that's how soap actually works, by breaking apart the hydrophobic and hydrophilic, or the hydrogen bonds in water. So it separates those out and breaks surface tension. And in doing that, by actually causing that separation out, it can start to break apart also the fats and oils, because it can use its hydrophobic end to actually be a part of, or actually move throughout the hydrophobic parts of oils to actually start to separate them out and cause them to go more into solution. The other thing that has a hydrophobic component are cell membranes. Okay, so the next property of water is that solid water or ice is very unique, because almost all substances are more dense when they're solid, but water is not. And again, it has to do with the polarity, the hydrogen bonding that occurs between water molecules. So what happens is actually when the hydrogen bonds between water molecules become frozen, they actually spread out into a crystalline form, making more of a lattice. So we talked before about like this lattice that is formed with hydrogen bonds between water molecules. But water molecules are constantly moving, and so they still become close to each other at different portions. So they are actually more dense than when they stop moving. So as you lower the temperature, the molecules of water move more slowly until they come to a point of stopping all of their movement. And when they stop that movement, they actually are allowed at that point to stretch out into their most comfortable position away from each other. So the polarity is actually at its full force as it slows down and actually moves apart into its comfortable position. And that is the expansion that occurs when water freezes and makes ice. So what that allows is that ice can float on liquid water because it's less dense, because those hydrogen bonds have become more ordered in the way that they have formed their lattice, because they're not moving close to each other, then far, and then close, and then far. They're actually just at that far position. So water reaches its greatest density at 4 degrees Celsius. Um, and if ice sank, this property of floating ice allows all the bodies of water to keep from freezing solid. Because if you think about it, if water froze the way most substances freeze, then ice would actually sink. It would be as dense or more dense than liquid water. And if that were the case, then all of our bodies of water would become solid, and there would be no life allowed below the surface wherever we have frozen water. Okay, so this is actually a little bit out of order. because this is talking about solute concentration in aqueous solutions. And this is really, this is placed in here just again to review from chemistry some terms. So you can pause this and write down these terms. Make sure these definitions are clear to you, because they will be thrown into questions. They'll insert something about talking about molarity, and it's just good for you to remember what exactly that means. So, for example, molarity is the number of moles of solute per liter of solution, whereas the molecular mass is the sum of all the mass of every atom in that molecule. And the number of molecules is usually measured in moles, and 1 mole has a very specific number. It's 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd molecules. So it's a standard, no matter what the substance is, 1 mole is going to be that number of molecules of the substance. So Avogadro's number and the unit Dalton were defined as that mole. That's 6.02 times 10 to the 23 Daltons. And that equals 1 gram of the substance. Okay, so the last concept to talk about in section 3 of this chapter is the idea of acids and bases. So hopefully, again, this is a review from chemistry, but it's an important part of biology, because acids and bases and the acidic or basic nature of our aqueous solutions within our living organisms determine life or illness. So a hydrogen atom in a hydrogen bond between 2 water molecules can shift from one to the other, and that hydrogen atom leaves its electron behind and gets transferred as a proton, or what we call a hydrogen ion. So the molecule that lost the proton is called a hydroxide ion, and it has the negative charge because it has lost a proton and it now has an extra electron. The molecule with the extra proton is called a hydronium ion, and we don't really use that term a lot in biology. Instead, we just represent that condition, that loss of electron, as an H plus or a hydrogen ion. So when we have a lot of hydrogen ions in a solution, we have a low pH or an acidic solution. And when we have a lot of hydroxide ions, so that negative condition, we have a high pH or an alkaline or basic solution. So we'll look at that a little more carefully here. Water is in a state of dynamic equilibrium, where the water molecules are disassociating from each other at the same rate at which they're being reattached or reformed. So we have this constant interplay of hydrogen atoms giving up their electron and becoming hydrogen protons. And we have hydronium ions, actually are what are giving up that electron, to hydroxide ions, which have the negative charge. So we don't simply have this polar molecule all the time. We actually get a dissociation or separation of a water molecule into its different atoms. So there's this forming, reforming, forming, reforming that's constantly going on. That's what we mean by a dynamic equilibrium. And so that's a really important concept because it is really the foundation of our whole idea of acids and bases and our idea of pH. So pH of water, because it's in a constant state of forming and reforming itself or separating apart and reforming, because we get equal amounts of that positive and negative charge occurring since it's a dynamic process, water is considered the most neutral pH. and so it's given the number 7, which means it is in that constant state of